Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia CZ-V tutorial series, continuing our look at the digital control wave today, the DCW, some of the more advanced options available to us. Just a quick recap, we start the synth. The synth starts off as a sine wave generator. You see that in the oscilloscope, and then we can dial in an amount of modulating wave via the digital control wave in order to generate that output instead. And any variation thereof, and you can hear me morphing between a sawtooth and a sine wave. So in that case, the DCW is basically acting as a depth control, basically allowing an amount of modulation being determined by this shape to apply to this shape, and we get our cumulative output. The custom wave also follows the same principle. Choose this big friendly custom button over here. Get a completely different graphical interface down below, and here we're able to define our own phase distortion function. It's a very fancy term, but basically what it's going to do is allow us to speed up and slow down the wave over the course of a single period. And this is what's going to allow me to demonstrate the fact that phase distortion and frequency modulation really are the same thing. So the phase distortion function allows us to describe over time, this is the beginning of one wave to the end of one wave. So this is a single cycle. Our base level is what the wave's going to start out looking like, and the target is what it's going to end up looking like. If I head over to my base selection and I create a new node, now you've seen that without any DCW being applied, so in other words, the modulating wave is still having no effect whatsoever, we've just defined a new core wave type for this synthesizer. It's no longer generating sine waves by default. In order to simplify what you're seeing in this output window, I'm going to link these two oscillators together. So they're basically always going to do exactly the same thing. We've basically just taken out of the equation the fact that we're dealing with two waves. Now we're really just basically dealing with one repeated. So here's our bass tone, and suddenly we've got a much more complex shape. You can see quite accurately being represented in the oscilloscope. Still nothing to do with the DCW. There's no modulation being applied here. We've actually fundamentally changed the core shape of the natural oscillator of the synthesizer. We haven't done that at any point beforehand. But this is a multi-point envelope, so I can start drawing some really pretty complex shapes. Now if I create something with many nodes, let's just add another couple in to make it pretty symmetrical. What you're looking at there is basically 10 different changes of direction in the course of a single cycle, 10 accelerations and decelerations. When you change the phase of a wave, you're basically moving it forwards and backwards in time. Well, that's pretty much exactly the same definition as frequency modulation, speeding a wave up and slowing it down periodically over the course of time. So whereas our oscilloscope was previously displaying 3 sine waves, which is basically 1.5 of these things, now we're going to get somewhere in the region of maybe 25-30 waves represented in that same oscilloscope view, because every single cycle of the wave, of the sine wave, is now being replaced, is now being accelerated and decelerated 10 times per period. Now I just counted those off screen. I'll obviously remove the time where I was doing this kind of thing in editing, but that's basically 27 waves there or thereabouts, which is almost exactly perfectly replicating this number of accelerations and decelerations. There's no better illustration than this to prove that frequency modulation and phase distortion, or phase modulation, if you want to call it that, are more or less exactly the same thing. Something else very interesting about this is that when I press that note again, just get my oscilloscope running, it's still registering as 65 Hertz, just like the original sine tone did. That's because tuners really, really don't like the fundamental not being the loudest wave. If you have a look at it in the spectrum analyzer, it's really obvious the loudest frequency is right up around 590. But because we've still got this fundamental down at 65, the tuner's being fooled into thinking that that's what the pitch is. It really isn't anymore. It's quite clearly something else. So messing around with phase like this, or frequency modulation, really screws with the laws of physics, and that's why it generates such interesting tones, because this nonsense that we see in the spectrum analyzer results in interesting stuff in our ears. Now, rather than plugging all of this modulation into the bass engine, instead I'm going to go back to our simple sine wave to start with. So now the synthesizer wants to generate one of these, and now I'm going to switch to generating a complex wave on the target. So this is going to give me access to the DCW again. Now I'm going to modulate between the simple wave, which you now see in blue now that we've moved one wave out of the way, and I'm going to be able to start from a simple sine wave, and by introducing the digital control wave, this phase envelope is going to be overlaid over the top, and we're going to hear that instead. And now we can define a DCW envelope just like we did last time, with a non-zero sustain point. Take about half a second. And so we're starting off with a little bit of manual DCW. In other words, part of that wave has already been morphed in, and then we introduce the rest over the course of the attack slope, and you can see that modulation occurring in the main synth output. All of that was done with linked oscillators. They absolutely don't have to be linked, and we can have a simple saw on the second oscillator. Now we've got some really fabulous girth to the sound. Listen to that. Awesome stuff. Okay, so that's custom waves. Let's have a look at the other complex modulation type. This is the resonant options. There are 3 of them. Again, I'll link it back up to make everything simple in the view down below. When I click one of the resonant types, we get a very unusual standard wave shape. If I take the DCW all the way down, it'll help me explain what's going on here a little bit. Now, to explain why these resonant modulation options exist, you need to understand what Casio have done when they developed this synthesizer. They wanted to avoid the necessity to have to implement expensive voltage-controlled filters. It's one of the components of an analog synthesizer that's more expensive. One of the advantages of voltage-controlled filters is that you get this feature called resonance, where if you turn the Q factor, the quality control of the filter up enough, the filter starts self-oscillating, in other words, generating tones independently around the cutoff point of the notes that have been played. Well, Casio wanted to basically replicate that, but that's a very difficult thing to do if you don't have any filter circuits. So what they did was they came up with this very clever algorithm where they were able to use the DCW as basically an independent tuner to generate a kind of pseudo resonance. So instead of the DCW introducing a depth, morphing from a sine wave up to whatever pitcher this wave was generating, now it's basically going to act as a filter frequency control, and we're going to hear what sounds like a resonant spike sweep through the filter range. It's a pretty decent representation of what a high Q resonant low-pass filter sweep sounds like, but it's generated entirely from phase modulation. This modulating wave is being applied to the basic sine wave underneath using a very clever algorithm that's got nothing to do with actual resonant filters. Now, before I started recording this tutorial today, I was just having a bit of a play through some of the presets on the synth, and I came across a great one that lets me demonstrate the resonant DCW to beautiful effect, because here you can see we've got 2 lines and resonant wave patterns everywhere. I'm just going to play some simple notes for starters. Very beautiful pad. But as you can see at the moment, if we have a look at the DCW maps, they're very gentle with no manual control being added. If I bring these things in, you're going to start to hear what sounds like a formant control. I'll explain this in a minute. And now, It's no mystery why Jean-Michel Jarre played with one of these things in the 80s. That's an incredible sound. What we've basically done here is we've picked out individual frequencies. Just turn one of the lines off and play another note. You can see we've got this resonant spike around 700 Hertz. So the fundamental tone is actually at 130. So the tune is getting that right. But we've got this resonant spike around 700 on line 2 because I introduced a different amount of DCW. Now the resonant spike is up around 800. And now when we bring both lines back in, we generated 2 separate resonant spikes. That's essentially the fundamental principles of formant. When you're generating vowel sounds, humans have we have really great ability to identify vowel sounds, and vowels are generated by unusual resonant peaks, effectively frequency spikes at fixed points in the frequency curve. So when you get a formant module in something like a modular synthesizer, it's basically hardwired to generate spikes at exactly these frequencies. And so you get this really beautiful vocal quality to the synth just by messing around with the various DCWs. The final thing to do is to dial in some sustain curve on our DCW envelopes. Don't worry about the fact that rate is now a number. If you were sharp-eyed, you would have noticed in the past episode it was measuring time. That's to do with our envelope type and is a conversation for a different day. What I am going to do is get them down into the 30s because that gives me a nice decent sweep. And that's going to give us Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.